There. Well, hello guys. This is April the 6th, Story of the World. We're starting on chapter 37. I know that all of you are having internet issues today, so am I. I'm going to go ahead and record the class, and then I will send it to the four of you so that you can watch it when you get a chance this week. We are doing chapter 37, so once we finish, you're just going to do chapter 37 test this week and then just upload it to me or take a picture of it, send it to me, text it to me, however you can get it to me. This chapter is about the new universe. So we're going to be talking about a couple of people. We're going to talk about Nicholas Copernicus. We're going to talk about Ptolemy, and we're going to talk about Galileo. And during the Renaissance time, we had young artists studying the ancient arts. We had young scientists studying books about the sky and the earth. We had philosophers reading about ancient philosophy from Aristotle and, different people. One of these scientists was named Nicholas Copernicus. He grew up in what is known as Poland. When he was 18, he started studying science at the university in the big city called Krakow. He always loved studying the stars. So while he was in the university there, he studied what was called astronomy, which is the science of studying the stars. He learned how to read star maps, how to measure the positions of where the stars are in the sky. When you look at the different stars, you've probably learned about the different galaxies, Orion and the Milky Way, and, where the planets are, where the Earth is, where the sun is. And he was very interested in that. The star maps show where stars are at different times during the year. Okay. And he also learned that the Earth was in the center of the universe. And it said that the Earth was surrounded by clear spheres, and those were like big balls made out of glass. But each one was bigger than the next, and they each had a planet attached to them. So the stars were on a big sphere by themselves, and they surrounded all the rest. All the spheres turned at different speeds. So this idea about the universe as a whole was based upon an Egyptian astronomer named Ptolemy. He had lived hundreds of years before this. And he had a book called the Almagest. And that explained why the planets moved around the sky at different speeds. Sometimes they got closer to stars, sometimes they got farther away. And it also explained why the sun moved across the sky from the east to the west. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west. So all of that explained all of that. And Copernicus had his instruments, and he was trying to measure positions of the stars and the planets. And then he compared what he was learning with the learnings of Ptolemy in his book. But he discovered that Ptolemy was not always right. This really surprised him because, if somebody's got something written in a book, of course it should be right. But it wasn't always accurate. And he thought that this book was always the most accurate, and he found out that it really wasn't. So he began to read other scientists' work and found that he was not the first person to study the stars that found out these problems. And he didn't see why the movement of the stars and the planets had to be so complicated. There was another ancient writer who was a Greek astronomer. His name was Aristarchus. He once said, well, the earth moves around the sun, not the other way around. So maybe that explained the difference between Ptolemy and Copernicus. There was other things, for example, Mars was brighter at some times of the year and not so bright at other times. Maybe Mars was circling the Earth in an oval shape. If it would, then it could be brighter when it was closer to the Earth and not so bright when it was farther away. But Mars couldn't move in an oval if everything was on a sphere, because then they would crash into each other, So it was very puzzling. So he knew there had to be a simple explanation. So then finally he realized, he said, you know what? If the Earth and all the planets went around the sun, then it would make sense. Because that meant the stars were farther away, and that would make more sense. But if this was correct, that means the universe was way bigger than anybody else thought. And he thought that this new idea showed that God did create the universe to be more magnificent than we could ever imagine. But the problem was Copernicus was Catholic. The church taught that man was the center of the universe. He was God's most spectacular creation. So the earth had to be the center of creation. So Copernicus thought, well, if I tell the Catholic Church about this, they're going to not like my ideas because I'm going against their teaching. So he wrote a little book called The Little Commentary on the Movement of Celestial Orbs and put his ideas into this little book. He let a few scientists read it, and they said, you need to print your ideas in a regular book that everybody can read. So he worked for years on this book about how he came to his conclusion. He called the book Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. The same year that book was printed, he died. Before it was published, right after it came off the printing presses, he was given a book, a copy of it, on his deathbed, and then he died. But the church did not like his ideas. They were against it. They were afraid that men would say that we're no longer part of God's plan. We're not center of the universe. Even Martin Luther thought Copernicus was wrong. But slowly and over time, people started realizing, well, maybe he's right. The scientists said, well, if the earth revolved around the sun, then the motions of the planets and the stars do make sense. So it started to become a normal idea that they all accepted. Today, Copernicus is called the father of astronomy because he was the first one to explain the movements of the planets and the stars in a way that made sense. Well, there was another man in Italy, and 21 years after Copernicus died, this little boy was named Galileo Galilei. He learned Greek and Latin so that he could read the ancient scientists' works because he was interested in science also. He learned logic, which is how you can argue for the truth of something based on the evidence that supports it. He didn't do very well in school because he always argued with his teachers, and they nicknamed him the arguer. But he was never happy to just take somebody's idea just because they told it to him. He says, well, I want to figure it out for myself and see if it really does make sense. If I can prove it to myself and I can see the evidence, then I can believe it, of course, And we should all be that way to some extent. We shouldn't just say, well, he told me that's the way it is, so that must be the way it is. Because we're not always right about everything, you know. So he decided to figure out things. He asked all kinds of odd questions. I mean, even one time he was sitting in church. He was looking at the chandelier that's hanging down from the ceiling with the lights. And he's like, why is that up there? He said it was swinging back and forth, and it was swinging in a long stroke. Then it went shorter and shorter. Why did it slow down? What was pulling it back and forth? You know, what made it work? So another day, he went up to the Leaning Tower of Pisa, which was also in Italy. He took two weights, one was heavier than the other, and he dropped them down from the top of the tower. Well, guess what? Both weights landed at the same time. That's strange, because he would have thought, well, the heavier one should land first, right? But it didn't. So he was curious. Why did that happen? So he says, well, you know what? Maybe the same force that was working on that chandelier was working on the weights. He was right. Today we call that gravity. So his experiments led to Isaac Newton making the theory about gravity and how it works. So he was the one that started the ideas about gravity. He spent a lot of time trying to figure out how things worked. He threw balls and measured how far they flew. He took pendulums and swung them back and forth and tried to understand what laws made them move in the certain directions. He moved objects with different weights and levers to see how force was going to be needed to move each one. He shot cannonballs out and figured the angle that they would go through the air. You know, he was always trying to figure out things because he was so curious. He would drip water from one cup into another and see how much time it took for the water droplet to reach the second cup and then fall. He spent a lot of years experimenting and making scientific instruments. He made a thermometer when he was 32. He was one of the first modern scientists. He also made a telescope, which I will show you here soon. He was the first one. He used one of the early ones to start the experimental method to figure out how the world worked. You know, if you're going to try to figure out how something works, you're going to try different ways to see if you can get the right result. So he experimented. He tried to see if his ideas lined up with philosophy. He made theories and then tested them doing experiments because, you know, if you want to learn and do things, sometimes we have to experiment, you know, even when you're cooking. Well, let's see if I add a little bit more of this spice, or let's add this to it instead of this. Does it make it taste better? Does it make it taste worse? You know, sometimes you just have to experiment on different things. Okay, and he says, you know, if something can't be measured, how do you figure it out? You can't. When he was almost 50, he discovered a scientific instrument that was invented by Dutch scientists, the telescope. They had two lenses in them so you could see objects that were very far away. As soon as he got one, he pulled it apart and tried to make it better. He made a telescope that was more powerful than anybody had ever seen before, and he could look at the stars and the planets with his telescope. So those are miles and miles away, and he was the first person to do that. He could see tiny moons around the planets. And he saw that planets and stars could rotate around something besides the Earth. So to tell the world what he discovered with his new telescope, he wrote a book called The Starry Messenger. He traveled to Rome to share his new telescope with the Pope. But guess what? He got in trouble. He was suggesting that Copernicus may have been right. And remember, they were against Copernicus's ideas for a long time. So Copernicus's book, The Revolution of the Heavenly Spheres, was put on a list that Catholics were never supposed to read. They said, nope, this is a bad book. It goes against the church. So, because the church insisted that the idea of the earth revolving around the sun said that God did not have man at the place of his universe, center of his universe. So Galileo was told to repent of his mistakes. He wanted to obey the church, so he says, okay, the sun could be going around the earth. And even though he believed the church was wrong, he was not willing to say that in public. But he did write a book about 3 imaginary scientists who had an argument. One has said that the earth was at the center of the universe. The second said the sun was the center. And the third listened to both and asked some questions. So when this book was published, the church leaders said, why are you reporting that Copernicus's theory is correct? He says, I'm not. Hold on a minute. He says, I didn't say which theory was true. I just described each one. You know, the sun is the center or the earth is the center. I'm just describing them. I'm not saying yes to either one. But this book was also added to the list of books that Catholics were never supposed to read. So he loved the church, but he was really upset by them condemning his book. He didn't believe that his ideas proved any part of the Bible to be untrue. But he thought that the priests condemned his writings and they were misinterpreting the Bible. So he put all of his ideas into another book called The Two Sciences. Not long after this was published, he died. He didn't live to see his theories be accepted by the world. But today, his discoveries are part of the science of physics. Physics is the study of why things, like orbiting moons and falling weights, behave the way they do. Because of his curiosity, the great modern scientist Albert Einstein called Galileo the father of modern physics. So, I am going to see if I can upload some pictures to you. Let me see if I can find them. Let's see here. No, wait just a second here. I'm going to hold on just one second. Okay. Wrong one. All right, I am back. All right, I'm going to see if we can open these up. And I'm going to show you a couple of pictures from Galileo. This is a drawing of his where he was trying to figure out how he could make a telescope, have the different lenses on there. And if you look at the writing, I think it's in probably Latin. Yeah, I would say probably Latin. And so that was in one of his books. This right here, this is Galileo right here with a bunch of other people. This is his telescope right here. And he's looking out at the sky. This was one of his other books. And he was looking out at the moons. And this is a picture of what he drew of showing what he could see with his telescope. He could see more detail. And again, I think these are in Latin. This picture right here is a couple of his drawings. This is the actual telescope that he was using, and this is in a museum, and it's a science museum somewhere. I can't remember where it was, but I looked it up on the internet. And I thought that was kind of cool. You know, you can go to these museums and you can see these different things. And so this was the actual telescope that he used. So I thought that was pretty cool. Anyway, so we are finished with this chapter. Next week, we're going to be working on chapter 38 and 39. I think we have 2 chapters next week, which are talking about Queen Elizabeth and England. So if we don't have any questions or anything, you know, then we're going to go ahead and go. You can feel free to email me if you need to, or call me or text me. When you finish chapter 37 test, just go ahead and upload it to me, or take a picture of your answers and just text it to me, or, you know, however you can do it. And we will see you next week. Alrighty. Bye-bye.